Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now Thursday, and it is time for the Thursday edition of the Gaggle live stream. So, welcome everybody who has joined me. Really much appreciated. And there's a few things I want to talk about. And as you know, we're really coming up to the annual NATO summit. It's going to take place in a few days' time. And I want to talk about that because it really is quite instructive about how first NATO and the European Union are now almost completely interchangeable. They're just, it's essentially one and the same institution, and both of which are in the business of expanding. The EU is more by way of promise of expansion, promise of membership down the road, and a lot of bribery along the way. And the goal of all of this bribery is, of course, that candidate states completely surrender their sovereignty in favor of rule from Brussels. So you get rule from Brussels without any democratic accountability, and without actual membership of the EU. So in other words, you're actually going to have Brussels dictating policy, but without you actually being in the EU and enjoying the whatever perks EU membership gives you. You don't even have that. Now, the expansion of NATO has, of course, been the huge source of instability on the European and Eurasian continents. It's been going on since 1991. And what it has done is push states that, that had very diverse populations, had very distinctive histories, languages, cultures, traditions, pushed them all into a kind of one-size-fits-all framework, whereby they had to be bundled into NATO. And I think it's been said, and I think this is very, very pertinent, that according to NATO, there is a right to join NATO, but there is no right not to join NATO. So if you make it a point that you don't want to join NATO, NATO is going to come knocking on your door, banging the door down, and demanding that you get with the program. And so we've seen it in country after country. NATO essentially threatening and forcing states to move toward NATO membership by way of NATO cooperation, by way of making the reforms necessary for NATO membership, and threatening anyone who goes against that program. Now, of course, the first example of that was Yugoslavia, and in particular, the Serbia, which was ruled by Slobodan Milosevic. So, Milosevic, I think, made clear that Yugoslavia would continue to pursue, in the post-Cold War world, the same foreign policy it had pursued during the Cold War, namely neutrality, not joining the NATO side, not joining the Soviet side. And it was made clear to him early on that that really wasn't an option, and that it was NATO and only NATO that was ahead for the Serbs. And of course, then led to all the various confrontations, the eventual bombing of the Serbs, first in Bosnia and Herzegovina, then of course then in Serbia proper. But the goal was, without question, that the Serbs need to accept that they are part of the transatlantic community. And we have seen time and again the same sort of pressure being applied, whether it's in Moldova, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in Armenia, that you get with this one size fits all Atlanticist agenda. And so the various issues that are raised, like, well, you got to, if you have a country such as Armenia, which has long historic traditions, going back centuries, linking it to Russia, well, that apparently must be ignored because Armenia must be brought into the Atlanticist community. Same thing. It was the same thing with the Serbs. Was again the Serbs had that they have language, religion, culture that linking them to Russia. No. Serbia needs to turn its back on Russia. And of course, as famously, the most famous, most notorious, most horrific example was of course in Ukraine, because as I pointed out, I think on Tuesday, that the issue with Ukraine was that it was Ukraine that didn't stick to its agreement. It was Ukraine that declared in its state sovereignty in 1990 that it would be neutral. That's what that was the deal that it had with Russia. It would maintain neutrality, would not form any kind of a military alliance with NATO. It wouldn't form a military alliance with Russia. And on that basis, then Russia would say, okay, well, we don't have a problem with your seeking independence. What changed was the stolen election of 2004, the Orange Revolution, the installation in power of Yushchenko, and the immediate move towards integrating Ukraine within the Atlanticist structures. Now, so there's some interesting comments here that I think on which I'm going to address in when we go to our comments in local. So I see there's a lot of very interesting comments. I'm really looking forward to addressing them. But you see, in the case of Ukraine, that move of trying to incorporate it within the Atlanticist structure was always going to provoke not just a confrontation with Russia, but a confrontation with its own population. It was a very divided country, and the people who lived in the east, people who lived in the southeast of the country, were not going to accept integration within NATO, not going to accept a membership of a military alliance that was hostile to Russia. Something similar happened in Georgia. And then, of course, we have the same thing is happening in Moldova. So the more you push for these kinds of one-size-fits-all membership patterns, the more you're provoking confrontation, because you're always going to come into conflict with those who really don't want to go down this path. These are divided countries, and very diverse populations, and they have very complex, long, rich histories linking them to their neighbors and not linking them to Brussels. So this project, this EU NATO project, is a war project, and it's becoming ever daily becoming ever more clearer. The expansion is leading to confrontations. The expansion is leading to wars with the neighbors, because these neighboring states become very troubled by a military alliance on their borders. And the notion, which is this nonsense that is put about by the NATO flags, the nonsense that somehow every state has the sovereign right to work out whatever security arrangement it wants, irrespective of the views of its neighbors, is absolute nonsense. It's a principle that's never been adhered to by any state at all. If states have, the right to be very concerned about what military alliances their neighbors are forging. It was a ludicrous idea. Well, Ukraine can join whatever alliance it wants, and Russia has no say in the matter. Well, of course, Russia has a say in the matter. Everybody has a say in the matter. If you're forming an alliance, and you're going to start deploying troops, you're going to start deploying missiles on the border, of your neighbor, particularly a military alliance that is explicitly hostile to Russia. It's a Cold War military entity, which is what NATO is. It simply continued as a Cold War military entity into after the Cold War. Then, of course, Russia is going to be very concerned with this military alliance stationing itself on its borders. And then we go back to the very obvious point that United States would never accept Russian or Chinese forces deployed in Mexico, Canada. And will not accept the principle of Mexico will say, hey, look, we're a sovereign country. I mean, we can have any forces that we want stationed on our territory. We're sovereign. If we want to station missiles on our sovereign territory, that's our right to do so. The United States has no right to tell us not to do so. Does anyone think that that's an argument that's going to fly? The United States will for 1 second accept such a ridiculous argument? Of course not. At the moment any Russian or Chinese forces were stationed in Canada or in Mexico, the United States would invade and would seize those military bases and seize any Russian or Chinese forces and make them prisoners of war. It's so obvious. It's just ridiculous and dishonest that we should even be having this conversation. But of course, it's the different standards, and of course, the starkest example of that was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba could absolutely have said, "Well, hey, we're a sovereign country. We can." We can deploy whatever missiles we want here. We can, we can call on our Russian friends and ask them to station missiles on our sovereign territory, and the United States has nothing to do with it. The United States has no say in the matter whatsoever. And of course, that was the principle that the United States did make clear, that unless those missiles were removed from Cuba, then the United States would have invaded the island of Cuba. And of course, by doing so, it would have, of course, removed the government of Fidel Castro. When Kennedy took the position that he took during the Cuban Missile Crisis, everybody, all of the European states, they all supported the position of the Kennedy administration. including de Gaulle and so on. Now, so this move that the EU and NATO in tandem have been making has been, of course, fueling one crisis after another, one area of instability after another, in a devastatingly destructive fashion. You know, as Ukraine, the almost obvious example, but the first time it was in Yugoslavia, it broke up a civilized, quite well functioning state. It broke it up into six states, continually at odds with one another. And then, of course, it expanded into Georgia, into Moldova, and so then this goes on and on and on. So today, Kaja Kallas, who I think embodies the NATO EU partnership, so she sent out this tweet, and I want to read it out because it's so illuminating. Remember, she is the foreign policy chief of the EU, and just let's look at what she tweeted out today. Okay, so it says, words of condemnation alone will not stop attacks on Kiev. Only sustained military support for Ukraine and increased pressure on Moscow can do that. Now, they'll just read that. Only sustained military support for Ukraine and increased pressure on Moscow can do that. She's calling for sustained military support. She's the EU. That's the EU. Now, let's remember, the EU is not under attack here. Ukraine is not a member of the EU. Russia is not a member of the EU. So therefore, Russia is not attacking the EU. And she says, "Oh, sustained military support." So the sustained military support by the EU in territory outside of the EU. Well, that's a warlike act. That's a warlike action on the part of the EU. Sustained military support, military involvement in a conflict is outside of EU territory and has no bearing whatsoever on the EU. But there she is. And she's saying that's what she's just openly declaring that's it. So sustained military support for Ukraine and increased pressure on Moscow can do that. This week, the EU has started disbursing the 6 billion euros under the 90 billion euro support loan to strengthen Kiev's defenses. Today, I will propose to sanction more entities supporting Russia's military-industrial complex in response to the strikes. The more Moscow attacks civilians, the more sanctions must be imposed. We keep raising the cost until Russia understands it cannot win. EU staff in Kiev are accounted for. I am deeply grateful to our colleagues on the ground who continue to work. So let's just remind ourselves. I know it's obvious, but let us remind ourselves of what the Treaty on the European Union says. The document, the founding document of the EU, Article 3 of the EU Treaty. Article 3. The Union's aim is to promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its peoples. The Union's aim is to promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its peoples. How is Kaja Kallas in any way promoting peace? She's advocating for war. She's openly advocating for war and talking about, essentially providing military support for a non-EU member state fighting a war against another non-EU member state. So you're not promoting peace in any way. Its values and the well-being of its people. So in what way is Kaja Kallas doing anything to promote any values at all and the well-being of the European people. So of course she's not. And that's, of course, keep in mind that, every time they start blustering in this way about, oh, Russian attack on this and Russian attack on that, when it's the other way, when Ukraine is attacking targets inside Russia, Kaja, Kallas and the rest of them are cheering it on. That's when we had, and we talked about this, I think, last week or whenever, that, oh, fantastic, great, we're hitting all sorts of targets on Russian. Oh, this is amazing, this is fantastic. The tide is turning. We're winning. And then when, you have the targets being hit inside Ukraine, suddenly, oh my God, look what the Russians are doing. We gotta apply military pressure. Either way, the solution is always the same. Oh, we gotta apply more military pressure on Russia. This is the foreign minister of the EU, which says it is a peace project. Now, as we've talked in the past about the state of Armenia. You remember we had an election a little less than a month ago. So there was an election. The EU, as is its wont, made a huge push to get involved in that election. They absolutely wanted to get Nikol Pashinyan over the finish line, not because I have any interest in Armenia, not because I care about Armenians, but because this would be bad for Russia. It's going to somehow push Russia out of the Caucasus. Now, the problem with and this again is the same policy, the NATO EU expansion policy, which just brings conflict in its train. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that it's indeed triggering more and more conflict in Armenia, making life for Armenians that much more difficult, because Armenia is now, coming into economic clashes with Russia, as is always obvious, because the Russians say, not unreasonably, is that, well, you gotta make up your mind which trading bloc you want to be a part of. If you're part of our trading bloc, the Eurasian Economic Union, then you can't really be also part of the EU trading bloc, because otherwise, you basically will have a free trade agreement with the EU, and that's obviously something that we can't do. So essentially, is all of the economic benefits that Armenia had enjoyed all these years, basically a captive market in Russia for its fruit and brandies, for its cut flowers. Basically, it was a very nice, cheap energy, all these things that it enjoyed. It's not enjoying them anymore. As part of it, the choice that Pashinyan has made, it's not enjoying any of those things anymore. So when that happens, the EU says, "Yeah, go on, keep going, keep doing what you're doing, and we're going to give you lots more money." So European taxpayer money is now going to subsidize and create an absolute basket case in Armenia, all for the sake of fighting against Russia. So we'll create an absolute dependency, a state based on absolute dependency, a parasitical welfare state of Armenia, and the Europeans, taxpayers, are going to pick up the tab. So today, Ursula von der Leyen was in Armenia. Where else would you expect her to be? Well, to encourage and, of course, to buck up the spirits of Nikol Pashinyan. And so, her office was issued this statement, and where's this? That's EU and Armenia strengthen their partnership, boosting resilience, trade, and connectivity. And today in Yerevan, the Ursula von der Leyen, together with Marta Koch, she's the enlargement commissioner, met with Pashinyan. The visit follows the recent general elections that showed the strength of Armenia's democracy and its commitment to continuing the path of reform and close partnership with the EU. And then she goes on. As the South Caucasus moves towards greater regional cooperation, new opportunities are emerging to deliver greater stability, prosperity, and security for its people. And then broader cooperation with the EU and Armenia is central to this vision. EU remains firmly committed to supporting Armenia in strengthening its resilience, boosting connectivity, and deepening ties. So all this stuff. And then the EU stepping up. Says in the current context, Armenia also faces growing external economic pressure. In response, the EU is stepping up its support to help diversify trade. So as I say, it's all this is all about you exacerbate the conflict with Russia. This is obviously hitting Armenia quite hard economically. Oh, but we'll step in, and we'll give you whatever money. So we're going to bribe you to keep up this conflict that is obviously detrimental to Armenia's interests. Now, what I think is also very interesting in all these statements, and there's a lot of them that were made today, and in all the articles and everything else, there's never any comment on the Armenians who have been driven out of Nagorno-Karabakh. That happened really within the last couple of years. They were all pushed out by, she's talking about democracy, cooperation, blah, 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 locally. Hey, 150,000 Armenians were driven out, massive ethnic cleansing campaign by the Azerbaijanis. Von der Leyen couldn't care less about that. There's no offer of support for that. Hey, well, how about you're going to have to rehouse 150,000 people? Armenia is a small country. 150,000 people needing to be rehoused, that's quite an economic burden on the state. No money for that. Money for instigating a trade war with Russia. Yeah, you can have that. Yeah. We'll give you some money for that. And then she's talking about democracy and cooperation. I mean, local. I mean, what cooperation? And what is also interesting here is that in this election, where Pashinyan won after a massive interference campaign run by the EU, Pashinyan did win, but he didn't get the majority he needed in the National Assembly to make a constitutional change. And the reason that he needs this constitutional change, because he told Azerbaijan that he's going to change the constitution and make clear that Armenia has no territorial claims on any territory that is a part of Azerbaijan, namely Nagorno-Karabakh, because that as the constitution now stands, Armenia is making claims on the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan said, well, we can have no normalization possible as long as that constitution has not been amended. Well, Pashinyan hasn't succeeded. He didn't get the kind of majority that he needed for that. However, Pashinyan could move towards what the EU would like him to move towards. I mean, he doesn't need to change the constitution for that. He could essentially move out of the the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO. He could leave that. I mean, he's not participating in that anymore. But he could leave that. He doesn't really need to change the constitution or anything for that. And he could gradually withdraw from the Eurasian Economic Union, which is obviously what von der Leyen wants him to do. He doesn't need a constitutional change for that. I mean, it would obviously be an absolute catastrophe. But this is all part of the confrontation that Pashinyan will have with the populace, which, and again, the EU will be on hand to help him out, and will say that any insurrection, any protest in the street against the Pashinyan policy are obviously the instigated by Moscow. But anyway, so here is then this EU document goes on. And then here von der Leyen said, the recent elections have shown the strength of Armenia's democracy. The Armenian people have chosen reform and a closer partnership with our union. No country should be pressured for a sovereign choice. This is why the EU is stepping up with 52 million euros and proposed tariff-free access for 80% of Armenia's exports to the EU. Armenia can count on us. So you see, they've got 52 million euros, and they're very nice. And they said no country should be pressured for a sovereign choice. But of course, that's exactly what has been done over and over again by the EU. That's exactly what they did to Ukraine at the time when President Yanukovych said, you know what, I'm not sure I'm going to sign this association agreement with the EU because I'm not sure it's such a great deal for Ukraine, which of course it wasn't. And then that was when the Maidan protest started, and all these ghastly EU people, Carl Bildt, and then that creep from Belgium, I always forget his name. I can see his face, but I always forget his name. You know, they're all screaming and shouting, and they all made the same. It's an existential choice, a civilizational choice for Ukraine. Is it with the East or with the West? And that's exactly what von der Leyen is saying to Armenia. You know, you're either with us or you are with Russia. And remember, even before the election, remember when Macron said that if this election goes the other way, if Pashinyan fails to win, we would just simply not accept the result. We'll say that this is basically Russian interference, that it was just simply that this was not a valid result, it's just a product of Russian interference. Anyway, so, you know, they're saying Armenia can count on us. And then Armenia's positioned itself as a beacon of stability and democratic resilience in the South Caucasus region. It's democratic resilience. It's fighting with the church, the apostolic church. It's imprisoning its political opposition. Leaders of the political opposition are in prison in Armenia or under house arrest. It has attacked the church, the democratic resilience. I mean, it's a joke. And then it says, welcomes the historic progress towards peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan and the continued normalization of relations with Turkey. And then the EU will support transport, energy, and digital connectivity, the projects, blah, 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 and so on, that will help unlock the economic benefits of lasting peace, and so on. And then it says that to further support local communities in Armenia and Azerbaijan, von der Leyen, notice the way it says President von der Leyen, as if she's some sort of president, President von der Leyen. She's not bloody president of anything. kind of an unelected administrator, but she grandiosely poses as the president of Europe, President von der Leyen, announced an additional 20 million euros in peace dividends. I wonder what a peace dividend is. This will ensure that people experience with tangible benefits of peace in their everyday lives, and includes investments in healthcare, demining, skills development, and local businesses. And then creating a lasting culture of peace. Now, this is, again, Europe has nothing whatever to do with any culture of peace. And then anyway, the autonomous trade measures announced by von der Leyen will liberalize around 80% of Armenian exports to the EU. The measures aim to support Armenian exporters in diversifying towards the EU market. So 80%, so a little bit. So they're essentially, we're going to remove tariffs on those things. Again, the European farmers, they're not being consulted on this. I mean, do they think this is a fantastic idea that essentially Armenian products will just enter tariff-free? The measures aim to support Armenian exporters in diversifying towards the EU market, including in sectors affected by recent trade restrictions. So essentially, the European farmers will be paying the price for this wonderful policy. So Armenia, which had this ready captured market in Russia, doesn't have it anymore. So now the Europeans are going to have to put up with Armenian goods. Von der Leyen doesn't care because it's all part of her geopolitical maneuver against Russia. And then here we have this. Following von der Leyen's announcement of 52 million euro support package for Armenia in early June, the EU disbursed 34 million euros within 2 weeks. The remaining 18 million will be released shortly. So, this is a lot of money is being spent here to address a crisis that the EU has brought about. This is all of this economic crisis in Armenia has been directly caused by von der Leyen and the EU. And here's Politico, of course, mouthpiece of the disgusting Axel Springer organization. EU extends Ukraine-style trade relief to Armenia, and that is actually an accurate headline. Ukraine-style trade relief. Well, gee, how did that work out? That Ukraine trade relief. The European von der Leyen announced Ukraine-style autonomous trade measures for Armenia, aimed at helping the country withstand growing economic pressure from Russia. Von der Leyen unveiled the package during a visit to Yerevan alongside Marta Koch. And then the autonomous measures, the same mechanism the EU previously deployed to support Ukraine's economy, would liberalize around 80% of Armenian exports to the bloc, approved by the European Parliament and EU member states. Brussels argues the package is designed to help Armenian producers diversify away from the Russian market, particularly in sectors targeted by recent Russian trade restrictions. And there we are, the cut flowers. And then here, even though, there's no need. Europe doesn't need cut flowers. There's plenty of brandies in Europe. It doesn't need Armenian brandies. Anyway, then here's more on von der Leyen, and so where we go. And here's Reuters. EU tells Armenia, you can count on us, as Russia keeps up economic pressure. But all of the pressure is coming from the EU. They're the ones who have been pushing Armenia into this kind of, whatever you want to call it, de facto agreement. Oh, you're now part of us. You have chosen us. We are there for you. The European Union pledged an additional 18 million euros in economic support for Armenia and liberalized some export rules. And then so Moscow imposed wide-ranging trade restrictions on Armenia in the lead up to the parliamentary election. And Russia accused the West of interfering in the vote and joined Armenia's opposition in alleging election violations. Yes, but it's an accurate depiction. So there's a here, and then Armenia is a member of the Russian-led Economic Union, and Moscow accounted for about 35% of Armenia's foreign trade last year, compared with 11% for the EU. Now, that, this little statistic, of course, is very interesting because it means that essentially Armenia does 3 times as much trade with Russia as it does with the EU, which would suggest that it is in Armenia's interest, obvious interest, in the interest of Armenia's farmers and producers, to maintain its ties with its main trading partner. It's 3 times as much. 3 times as much trade is done with Russia as it does with the EU. Von der Leyen and the EU step up and say, no, you've made a choice. You want to be with us. And this is obviously going to cause you great economic hardship, great deal of economic dislocation. It doesn't matter. We're going to shower you with money. We just shower you. You just become a kind of a hooked on welfare. You become a kind of an EU parasite state. So where before you were a serious country with serious trading partners, now you're just simply living from check to check signed by Brussels. And then so this is that. And so, I know Armenia is still facing significant economic pressure from Russia, but rest assured, when pressure mounts on our partners, the EU steps up. You can count on us. We're gonna create all these problems, and then we're gonna be the solution to your problems. And anyway, so she said she will remove tariffs from nearly 80% of Armenian exports. Now, notice how she just makes these decisions without any kind of democratic accountability. I mean, what do Europe's farmers think of that? What do Europe's producers? She just makes these decisions, right? There's no democratic accountability here at all. I mean, she just acts as a dictator. Oh, we're just going to lift these the trade barriers against Armenian products. She did the same thing in the case of Ukraine, remember, and that led to all kinds of protests in a variety of countries, which was suddenly the farmers in Hungary, in Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, they were suddenly competing with cheap Ukrainian grain that was now being dumped in their countries. It was, again, all part of the support for Ukraine at the expense of the European farmers. Anyway, so she goes there, and then it was just from there. Okay. And then here we have, and then, now she also wants to help Armenia diversify its energy supplies. Armenia had a kind of a nice deal. It was getting cheap gas from Russia. The European Union wants to help Armenia diversify its energy supplies. And a team of EU experts will arrive in the country next week to support those efforts. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen made the remarks during a joint press conference with Pashinyan in Yerevan, responding to a question on whether the European Union is prepared to assist Armenia if Russia uses natural gas prices as a tool of political pressure, given the country's heavy dependence on Russian gas supplies. Well, none of that is actually true. The issue, you know, with Russia, you pay the price that you signed up for. If you signed a contract with Russia, then that's how much you pay under the contract. Now, it's a different matter if you have to renew the contract, because then you're not going to get the preferential rates. That's the issue. That Russia doesn't just simply decide from one day to the next. You know what? I think we're going to charge you twice as much as tomorrow as you were paying yesterday. It doesn't do that. Russia basically fulfills their contract. But if you're going to sign a new contract, then yeah, all sorts of new issues will then arise. And if Pashinyan, wants to play nice with the EU and with NATO, then yeah, the Russians will say, well, why should we go on selling you gas at prices that are below world prices? But von der Leyen's, oh yeah, yeah, we'll give you anything. Just say no to Russia. Whether European competitors, and then it says, when it comes to energy, this is von der Leyen speaking. When it comes to energy, you need a comprehensive and multi-layered strategic approach. Just as we are helping Armenia diversify its trade, which will strengthen the country's resilience, we also want to help Armenia diversify its energy supplies. That is why a team of experts from the European Union will travel to Armenia next week. We have extensive what's a team of experts going to do there? But where are you going to get your gas from? The team of experts can't just simply manufacture gas there and then. Hey, we've got some gas here for you. A team of experts from the European Union will travel to Armenia next week. We have extensive experience in situations like this. We have seen it in Ukraine. We have seen it in Moldova, and we, as the European Union, have also experienced elements of such a situation. So we have considerable expertise in helping countries diversify their energy supplies. Where's that energy going to come from? I mean, who's going to provide this gas for Armenia? So Azerbaijan? Well, I don't think so. Azerbaijan, as we've seen, is not happy by the fact at the result of the election that Pashinyan does not have the votes to amend the constitution, so he's not going to provide any gas, even if he were willing to do so. So this is all essentially a fantasy, but the goal here is they cannot afford to have Armenia move into the Russia camp. They have you have to stay with us. Anyway, so that's the way with Armenia. But of course, the example par excellence of the creation of an absolute basket case of a state, all about NATO, the EU, and so on, was of course the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And quite by chance, while von der Leyen was in Armenia, Kaja Kallas was in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, as you know, the outcome of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina really was not very satisfactory for NATO. So what they had wanted was to create a unified state in Bosnia and Herzegovina, run by a client of theirs, such as the Muslim leader Ali Izetbegovic. But Izetbegovic did not have the forces at his disposal. He couldn't win the war. The Serbs, fought, with great resilience and great skill, and essentially, the Izetbegovic, even with all the NATO help that he received, simply could not defeat the Serbs. And so the outcome of that war was this divided state. So you had the Republika Srpska, which was obviously dominated by the Serbs, and then the what now they call the Bosniak Croat Federation, but it was called the Muslim Croat Federation. Now, since that was 1995, and as we've discussed before, the way NATO responded to this very unsatisfactory outcome was to vest this office of the Office of the High Representative, to vest this office with powers that were never envisaged under the Dayton Agreement that ended the war, in the hope that once they shove in some completely undemocratic figure into that slot, and then he can run it like a dictatorship, they can actually coerce the Serbs, primarily the Serbs. They can coerce the Serbs into accepting a unitary Bosnian state. And so immediately after the signing of the Dayton Accords, this is early in 1996, the key European powers then set up this, the Peace Implementation Council. And then, they met in Bonn in 1997. And then this is when they created the Bonn powers to give this Office of the High Representative, powers far greater than any of the democratically elected politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, that was, 30 years ago. And Bosnia and Herzegovina has basically continued to be essentially a ward of the EU. I mean, it's not in any way an independent state. It's not a sovereign state. It basically it's kept going. Simply, it keeps going. Largely by the threats regularly issued by NATO or the EU that if the Serbs dare to try to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina, all hell is going to be unleashed on them. Hey, remember what we did to you in the 1990s? We can do this to you again. So don't even think about seceding. So again, we have this ridiculous notion in which first the Western powers encouraged the secession of the republics from Yugoslavia. Oh no, we can't keep Yugoslavia together. No. We have to recognize these secessions. But nobody's allowed to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So you created this fake state, but nobody's allowed to secede. You can secede from Yugoslavia, but you can't secede from Bosnia. So years have gone by, and having created, again, once you create this sort of welfare dependency, that's never going to be resolved. And of course, the EU and NATO doesn't want this to be resolved. So we just keep it going. We keep appointing these various Office of the High Representatives. From usually one of the most belligerent and anti-Serb countries, the last one, who's just been forced to resign, Christian Schmidt. It's not usually, there's an Austrian or a German or a Brit who holds the position of Office of High Representative. and can hope, the plan is that, just through a process of just exhausting the Serbs, they will eventually give up and accept this unitary state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, recently there's a kind of a fly in the ointment for NATO and the EU, and the fly in the ointment is the Trump administration. So after all, it was the Americans who bombed Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Americans who pushed for that NATO bombing in 1995. Remember, the Europeans were a little skittish on the issue of bombing back then. It was the Clinton administration who pushed for it. And so the Americans, were on board with the Europeans, with Dayton and everything else. But now, for whatever mysterious reason, there's business deals that involve the Trump family. They've suddenly, the United States has dropped its hostility towards Bosnia's Serbs. They haven't dropped their hostility towards Vucic and Serbia, but they have dropped their hostility towards the Bosnian Serbs. And so, if you recall, I mentioned this before, much to my astonishment, the astonishment of many people, all the sanctions that had been imposed against Milorad Dodik, the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, were lifted. And Dodik was free to travel to the United States, meet all sorts of Republican politicians, and clearly some kind of negotiations are taking place between the Republika Srpska and sort of businessmen associated with the Trump family. This has, of course, caused some consternation in Europe, because they thought, hey, this is our project. We've got a project. You got to keep the project. This is going all the way back to the Clinton years, going back to the Bush years. Hey, we were always on the same page. The ultimate goal is a unitary Bosnian state. The ultimate goal is always to threaten the Serbs. And suddenly, we're not getting this from the Americans. And if you recall, we did a live stream on this when recently, when Christian Schmidt, a very bitter Christian Schmidt, he's the one who ensured that Dodik would be imprisoned, or at least Dodik would be removed from the presidency. He thought this was his great crowning achievement, that he managed to get Dodik removed as president of the Republika Srpska. Now, very much embittered, feeling that he had been pushed out by the Americans. So he went before the UN Security Council, complaining and saying, we need more powers, more bomb powers. We need the Office of the High Representative must be vested with more powers. And I hate all these nationalists. I hate particularly the Serb nationalists. I hate the Serb nationalists. And then the Americans said at that UN Security Council meeting, and this is obviously they were getting instructions from on high, that, we would like to see this position of the Office of the High Representative. We want to see it phased out. It's gone on for too long. It was never envisaged to be a kind of a permanent thing. We want it phased out. And we don't want to vest it with more powers. This was going very much against the policy that had prevailed up until then. And the Europeans and Kaja Kallas are kind of trying to catch up with this. This is our project. It was a sort of early Armenia. This is what we do. We just create fake states. Which are dependencies on ours. So it's Georgia, Moldova. It's like Moldova. It's a permanent ward of ours. We run Moldova. We run Georgia. That hasn't worked in Georgia, but they haven't quite given up. And now we're going to be running Armenia. But the first the first exemplar of this was Bosnia and Herzegovina. So here is a story in from this is Politico, of course. How America is breaking Bosnia's brutal politics. This is from today's Politico. The two Trump administrations have steadily hollowed out that commitment, this commitment towards Bosnia and Herzegovina, and some of the most destabilizing figures in Bosnia right now are Trump allies such as Rudy Giuliani and Rod Blagojevich. Blagojevich, the disgraced former governor of Illinois, has promoted far-right talking points about a persecuted Serbian Christian minority. His own background is ethnically Serbian by a radicalized Muslim leadership in the country. So these are, it says, oh, how terrible. What an absolutely outrageous notion. Absolutely outrageous notion. Now remember, the war started, long before anyone knew anything about Blagojevich. The war had started because there was no way in hell that an independent state of Bosnia and Herzegovina would be acceptable to all three of the constituent nations of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in particular, there was on the part of the Serbs, there was a very real fear that the state would be dominated by the Muslims, and they just simply were not going to accept it. They were not going to accept living in a Muslim-dominated state. So this is nothing to do with Blagojevich. And here, the radicalized Muslim leadership. And then it says, Giuliani promotes the same kind of Christian victimization narratives as Blagojevich, and also often draws comparisons between Trump and Dodik, an ultra-nationalist, pro-Putin, here we go, ultra-nationalist, pro-Putin, Bosnian Serb leader, saying they're victims of the same lawfare movement led by liberal or woke judges. Dodik was stripped of his presidency last year after directly violating the Bosnian constitution and encouraging separatist activity. He didn't violate anything whatsoever. This was a rigged system, and essentially a rigged move by Christian Schmidt, in order essentially to force the Serbs of Bosnia to reject his decrees as obviously in violation of the democracy of the Republika Srpska. That was the whole point. That's why Schmidt did this. Schmidt issued these decrees, which decree was basically, hey, my word is higher than any word of the institutions of the Republika Srpska. And so therefore, anything that I say, it carries a lot more weight than legislation passed by the assembly of the Republika Srpska. So, this is nothing to do with any constitution. Now, naturally, the Republika Srpska passed legislation saying, no, the assembly carries more weight than the word of an unelected official appointed by some strange entity, the Peace Implementation Council, an entity, incidentally, that isn't even answerable to the United Nations Security Council, because the UN Security Council had repeatedly complained and said, we never, the Russians and the Chinese said, we never signed off on Christian Schmidt to be the office of the High Representative. But Politico just repeats this absolute claptrap that he somehow violated the Constitution. He didn't violate anything. I mean, these are just what Schmidt was trying to do. He knew that there was no way that the Assembly of the Republic of Srpska was just going to accept the notion that he, an unelected bureaucrat appointed from abroad, his word carries more weight than legislation adopted by democratically elected representatives. They knew they wouldn't accept it. And of course they did. They rejected it, and that was the moment for him to strike. It was the whole thing was a very carefully crafted operation to get Dodik out. That's what Schmidt did. This Schmidt more or less admitted that this was a maneuver by him to get the democratically elected Dodik out. But Politico just so accepts this rubbish. And encouraging separatist activity. Anyway, the Christian victimization rhetoric employs the same divisive logic that produced the war itself. In the 1990s, political and military leaders turned a country praised for its diversity against itself, pitting its nominally Orthodox Christian, Catholic, and Muslim populations against one another as neighboring Serbia and Croatia backed forces across the border. Now, notice what they said, praise for its diversity against itself. What was praise for diversity? It was Yugoslavia, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, that was praised for its diversity. It was this Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia that Bosnia and Herzegovina insisted that he wanted to separate itself from. So the intolerance came from Izetbegovic, the leader of the Bosnia and Herzegovina. Milosevic had offered, he made this offer to Izetbegovic, who said, look, even if Croatia and Slovenia secede from Yugoslavia, we can still maintain a Yugoslavia that would comprise Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro. We can still do it. And within this kind of diminished Yugoslavia, within that, the Muslims would be the second most populous nation. And Izetbegovic refused this deal and said, no, I'm not having any of it. I'm leaving. I got to separate myself. Who's being divisive here? What kind of tolerance is this? They said, he's being offered, hey, we can continue Yugoslavia. And in this, the Muslims, already at that time, would be the second largest population, given the much higher reproduction rate, they would eventually, really within a few years, be the largest population. And no. He pushed for the independence. And then his Politico just, tolerance. What tolerance? This is a person who said that Islam and the non-Islamic world are not compatible. I mean, he wrote a book called The Islamic Declaration. He said Islam and the non-Islam are incompatible. Anyway, that's against one. Let's never insert back. I don't know. And then here is Kaja Kallas. So she was in Sarajevo today to back up the troops, at UFOR. And here she is. It says, it's good to be back in Bosnia and Herzegovina, my third visit in 16 months. Why is she spending so much time in Bosnia and Herzegovina? That speaks to the importance of this country to the European Union. As I was here recently today, I want to speak more broadly about the lessons this country has taught us. I bring you 3 examples. First, peace has endured for 31 years because it is enforceable. European troops, alongside those from other countries, have been on the ground since the moment the Constitution entered into force. So right away, you'd have to say, well, what kind of a peace is this? With if you've retained the forces for 31 years. 31 years. I mean, that's not exactly a great, a very successful undertaking. And then it says, you play a role in supporting the authorities of Bosnia and Herzegovina. You have built trust among the local population and international partners. You help maintain a safe and secure environment for all citizens. In 1995, when the Dayton Accords were signed, a high representative was also designated to spearhead oversight of the peace. A new person should soon take over, but the duty remains the same: to prevent a return to the past by focusing on the country's future. This is more important than ever because the security situation is calm but fragile, and elections in October would also increase political polarization. Well, if you don't want to go back to the past, then you want to avoid making the mistakes that were made in the past. And the mistake that was made in the past was to push for a unitary state by creating a centralized Sarajevo-run state that guarantees that there will be another war. The Serbs are no more likely now to accept rule from Sarajevo than they were in 1992. And anyway, so she goes on here. We want to see an individual in this role who can unify the country and gradually phase out the need for the high representative. So now notice how she's suddenly repeating the American point. It was the Americans who made that point at that UN Security Council meeting I was talking about. We want to phase out the need for the high representative. So she repeats this. Second, experience of the country underlines why unity also amongst external actors is also important. EUFOR Althea is a unique example of EU-NATO cooperation. It shows what we can achieve when we work together. Back in 1995, U.S. support for the rule of law, fighting corruption, and strong institution building was also essential to steer the country in a positive direction. The Dayton Accords succeeded because the US and Europe were aligned. So notice how she's repeating the mantra from that article from Politico, kind of lamenting that the US and Europe were not really aligned. Today, our alignment on these key principles still offers the best chance of long-term stability of this country. And then, which brings me to the third example of what this country teaches us today. Ending a war is just the beginning. Building the state is the hard part. And then so she goes on the one hand, a well-functioning, stable, and independent state requires checks and balances, strong institutions, and a military of its own. That is why the European Union is helping to strengthen the country's defense capabilities. Another 15 million euros of European money was allocated in May this year for the armed forces. Our total support now is 35 million euros, and we are exploring ways to provide even more. One should say, by the way, that there was nothing in the Dayton Agreement about creating an armed force of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It basically created these two separate entities and tried to minimize their interaction to the greatest extent possible. So there was never any talk about creating an armed force or anything like that. It's just, basically just you do your thing and you do your thing. But this is all just made up, claiming that this was envisaged some armed forces. And then, but as internal reforms are needed, and then under the growth plan for the Western Balkans, close to €1 billion was initially earmarked for Bosnia and Herzegovina, but because the reform process has been too slow, over €100 million has already been lost. That's a lot of money lost. Close to €1 billion. So again, that's what I mean. You create this basket case, and then you're just throwing money, at it all the time, without any real prospect of any improvement. But that's the whole point. They don't want any real improvement. What they want is the creation of states that are in a permanent state of dependency on Brussels. That's what they envisage in Georgia. That's when they have their plan in Moldova. It's obviously their plan in Ukraine, and as we've seen, that's the plan in Armenia. You just want, so yeah, you've pissed away, millions, 100 millions lost. Without progress soon, there is a risk of losing another €370 million. That's a lot of money. If without progress, you're losing €370 million. Where is all this money coming from? When political progress stalls, people pay the price. Becoming a member of the EU will transform the lives of ordinary people in this country. And this is a realistic option. Right now, we are drafting the accession treaty for Montenegro. Albania is not far behind. We have started negotiations with Ukraine. Moldova's accession is coming along too. We do not want to see Bosnia and Herzegovina left behind. 30 years ago, the Dayton Accords ended a war, creating the conditions for post-war development, and ushered in 30 years of peace. And so there we are. There are still lessons to be learned. And so here, peace without enforcement is wishful thinking, unity among the international community, and then the real test for ending the war is not abandoning the work too soon. And that's why the European Union is not going anywhere. You can count on us. So she uses that expression, you can count on us. It's the same expression that von der Leyen used in Armenia. This is now the buzzword. You can count on us. It's a complete failure. I mean, it's a total failure. But from their perspective, it's actually quite successful because they say, hey, we have created, where before, Roger, the situation, go back 1991, 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina is an integral part of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Croatia, Slovenia move with German encouragement. They move to secede without bothering to negotiate their terms of exit. Then Milosevic makes the offer, we can continue Yugoslavia and you can continue being a part of Yugoslavia. Bosnia and Herzegovina says, no, we want to go our own way. That, of course, provokes a war, as it was obvious to everyone at the time that this was going to lead to a war. Now you've actually created a state which is permanently dependent on the Brussels bureaucracy. It's a complete basket case. I mean, all the money that's squandered, and without any hope of getting anywhere. Oh, we need to hire, we need to appoint a new office of the High Representative. And he's going to do the same thing as the last office of the High Representative. He's going to keep trying to centralize all power in himself, and then hope he can just somehow ram something through in the face of Serbian opposition. So it's the same idea. You go on decade after decade. And for Kaja, Kallas, or von der Leyen said, oh, yeah, well, that's pretty good. So in much of the same way with Armenia, oh, well, that's good. you basically you had a captive market in Russia. You had subsidized energy from Russia. All that's going to go. And what's the EU offering? Well, you've joined us. You're part of our team now, and we're going to just keep writing out checks. And then we can complain about corruption. Well, of course you're going to get corruption. How? I mean, if you just keep doling out money to states, of course you're going to get corruption. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, if it's money that you haven't earned, then yeah, it's going to be misspent. That's the point. Anyway, let's now go to our locals board and talk to the gagglers, the people who really make this community viable, the people who obviously they worry about the dogs. They want to make sure that the dogs are rewarded for their for their journalism, their political acumen. But this is the one. These are the people who want to maintain this gaggle political and locals community. So thank you everybody who is a member of our community. And as I always say, if you want to interact with me, if you want me to answer your questions, if you want me to address any issues, please join this political locals community. And obviously there's great people who are members, really, really smart, really talented people, and there's so much that's interesting that's being continually posted on this on our locals board that it's hard for me to keep up. So this it's well worth the sort of the minuscule amount that you'd have to pay to join the community. So please join the gaggle.locals.com. You're not going to regret it. Anyway, first question. We got Ericos. Oh, good afternoon, Gagglers. Good evening. Okay, NKMRD. Good afternoon. Good evening. Thank you for being here. Anyway, here's Cynthia. Film scholar, film expert, with an amazing knowledge of all manner of genres of filmmaking, and who has been contributing to the Gaggle now for some time, allowing us to enjoy and benefit from her amazing knowledge of cinema. And of course, she is the one who really makes the Gaggle weekly film screenings particularly special. So, as you know, every week, on the basis of a poll, we screen a movie, always something good, always something interesting. So it's there posted on the on our Gaggle board, and to go together with the screening, you have Cynthia provides us with very informed, really interesting, intriguing comments, background information about the actors, about the producers, directors, all of the intricacies that went into the making of a film. And so it's yet another incentive to join the Gaggle, the gaggle.locals.com. You get to see decent films, and as you're watching the films, you can get to enjoy Cynthia's commentary. So we've been featuring films for the last 2 weeks on the subject of, to coincide with the World Cup. We've been featuring films that feature international sporting events. So we had Grand Prix last week. This week we had kind of a documentary on the great Ferenc Puskás, the great Hungarian football star of the 1950s and 60s. And next week, because it's we're going to feature another runner-up in that poll, and this one will be the two Escobars. So that's kind of an interesting film, um, that which is about the World Cup, and this again, you will be able to watch this, and enjoy Cynthia's. I'm sure Cynthia will provide us with really interesting commentary. So we're going to show next week the two Escobars. This week you can watch the documentary on Pushkash. Anyway, that was by way of introduction. And then, so Cynthia's question today says, Kit Klarenberg argues that U.S. hegemony was forged in Bosnia, but the unworkable post-1995 protectorate model is now failing. The region is broke, packed with NGOs, and the Bosnian Serb area wants to split. While Washington publicly forced Bosnian unity under the Dayton Accords from Clinton's term in office through Trump's first term and Biden's presidency, yet declassified papers show the U.S. secretly planned to let Serbs secede within years of the 1995 peace agreement. Yeah, I saw that article by Kit Klarenberg, and I have to say I was very, very unpersuaded by this. I don't think it's true that the Clinton administration was planning for the Serbs to secede. What I think the documents show is that they were the policymakers at the time discussed the possibility of what would happen if the Serbs were to secede, but the whole thrust of the Clinton administration policy was to force the unity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But because remember, if you go back through the phase, so the breakup of Yugoslavia, spring of 1992. After Croatia and Slovenia had seceded, and it became clear to the European Union Conference, which was headed by Lord Carrington, that Bosnia and Herzegovina was going to secede. What they tried to do was to see if this independent Bosnia and Herzegovina, whether that you could make sure that the three constituent nations felt themselves secure within it. Because they kind of gave up. They said, well, we can't stop at the secession. And in any case, this Robert Badinter, the Badinter Commission, which was appointed by the EU conference, the one that was chaired by Lord Carrington. So Badinter had already essentially said, hey, Bosnia and Herzegovina can secede, and put down ridiculous criteria to recognize any referendum that was held. I mean, so ridiculous was this, absolutely idiotic was the Badinter Commission's recommendation, that even though it knew that the Serbs of Bosnia would boycott the referendum, even then, the Badinter says, well, we can recognize the results of the referendum, provided we can get something like, I can't remember, 60%. So we got a particular number. So long as you got 60% vote in favor of independence, we're going to recognize it. So even though one of the constituent nations, the Serbs, were going to absolutely refuse to take part in the referendum, Badinter said, I don't care. We're still going to recognize independent Bosnia. But anyway, once that became clear that this was going to happen, that Bosnia would be independent, Carrington tried to see, well, can we actually create situation whereby the three constituent nations can live together in an independent Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so, therefore, could they be sort of divided up into these three autonomous areas? And that was the famous Carrington-Cutiliero plan. So independence, but autonomy for the three constituent nations. That was the Cutilleros of April, May of 1992. So, and that was agreed upon. Izetbegovic, Karadzic, and Mate Boban, was the Croat leader. They signed this agreement, said, okay, fine, we'll have independence, but autonomy for these three constituent nations. And it was this agreement that was then sabotaged by the Americans, who went to tell Izetbegovic and says, hey, well, if you don't like it, why sign it? And so Izetbegovic withdrew his signature. My point in bringing this up is that time and again throughout those years, there were plans on the table that first the Bush administration and then the Clinton administration refused to accept because they were too generous to the Serbs. You remember that the one after the Cutiliero plan was the Vance-Owen plan. And I talked about this on Tuesday. And I said how essentially Milosevic expended enormous political capital on trying to get the Serbs to agree to the Vance-Owen plan, even though the plan obviously was very detrimental to Serb interests. It was a much worse plan for the Serbs than the Cutiliero plan. But nonetheless, Milosevic tried to do it. But the point was that while Milosevic was trying desperately to persuade the Serbs to accept this plan, the Clinton administration was against it because the Clinton administration said, oh, this is too generous to the Serbs. This is rewarding ethnic cleansing. They said, no, we can't support this Vance-Owen plan because it's rewarding the Serbs. So, in fact, it was ultimately undermined by the referendum that took place in Bosnia. The Serbs overwhelmingly rejected it, despite Milosevic's entreaties. But it was also undermined by the Clinton administration. It says, well, we're not going to support this because it's too generous to the Serbs. And then, of course, you had the Owen-Stoltenberg plan, which again the Clinton administration opposed because it was too generous to the Serbs. And so finally, then they came up with this. Because Clinton, I think, wanted out he was concerned about his re-election, and the final kind of agreement that was signed at Dayton. But the point about that agreement was that they cobbled together a deal whereby they could at least say, well, we've got a unitary state. This is the unitary state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is what we had been insisting on, the Americans had been insisting upon since 1992. So I just see no evidence at all, given the animus, the sheer hostility, hatred, animus, loathing that the Clinton people had towards the Serbs. I just might the claim, Kit Clarenberg's claim that there was some secret notion that they were going to sign off on the Serbs seceding, and thereby, essentially, which, I mean, if you secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina, your next step would be, of course, to join Serbia. So this would have led to a kind of an increase in the size of Serbia. I mean, the idea that the Clinton administration would ever have signed on to this. I mean, who we're talking about here? We're talking about 1995. We're talking about Madeleine Albright, who had this, obsessive hatred for the Serbs. just absolutely hated the Serbs. No, it's always remained a kind of a mystery why she did, but she really did. I mean, just look at the speeches that she delivered when she was um, the Clinton administration's permanent representative at the United Nations. Um, and the way she talked about the Serbs, and then of course once she took over as Secretary of State in Clinton's second term, she immediately moved to create the groundwork for a much bigger bombing of the Serbs than Clinton had done in 1995. So, frankly, I just don't see any evidence at all that the Clinton people were thinking of allowing the Serbs to secede. When everything that they had done up until then, and everything that they were continued to do, include the bombing in 1999, which showed huge loathing towards the Serbs. So, and I'm not buying it. It goes against everything that we know about the Clinton administration's policy, and it just goes against common sense. So, anyway, thank you for that, Cynthia. Then Cynthia goes on. Kit notes a deep irony here. The war aimed to help Muslims defeat the Serbs who wanted to stay in Yugoslavia, not leave Bosnia. Um, well, okay, all right. Seeing that Albright secretly backed, I mean, Albright did not back Serb secession, reveals her true mindset. Yet this forced unity has shifted under Trump's term as the West quits without a backup. Kit compares the departure of the rapid Afghanistan collapse, warning that the U.S. is leaving its allies, making Serb secession likely, and leaving the EU unready for a major new war in the Balkans. I don't really agree with any of that. Albright never envisaged, and Clinton never envisaged Serbian secession. As I already said, and the the issue the issue in Bosnia and Herzegovina was actually more, as I said, was really much more complicated than that. Obviously, Karadzic and Milosevic wanted to preserve Yugoslavia, but as you can see by the fact that Karadzic signed the agreement, the Cutiliero agreement, and then eventually he didn't want to sign the Vance Owen plan, but he kind of was persuaded by Milosevic to sign the Vance Owen plan. He did accept the Owen Stoltenberg plan. So all of these plans envisaged an independent Bosnia. In other words, by 1992, it had become clear to the Serbs that that there was no way that they would be able to stay within Yugoslavia, that Bosnia and Herzegovina will be independent. The condition, therefore, was this: we can be within Bosnia and Herzegovina, but we would have to have a great deal of autonomy within Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so those plans that envisaged autonomy, they were acceptable to the Serbs. As I say, that's why Karadzic accepted those agreements. Now, whatever the issue, whether there were plans to eventually to secede, who the hell knows what would happen along the way. You can't tell what's going to happen in 10, 15, 20 years' time. That doesn't mean that they were seriously thinking about Serb secession, but maybe 10, 15, 20 years' time, then maybe they will secede. But that's not what they were thinking about at that time. What was important for Karadzic was that the Serbs would not be a part of a unitary Bosnian state in which they would be essentially dominated by the Muslims, which had now become the most populous of the nations. That was the key. I mean, obviously, everyone wanted, Karadzic, Milosevic, they wanted to preserve Yugoslavia. But once that became clear, after the Badinter Commission recommendation, and that Yugoslavia was no more, that there was that option was no longer on the table, then the next option was to maintain a level of autonomy and to avoid being dominated by the Muslims. So there's no evidence. There's really no evidence right now that the Serbs are going to push for the breakup of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think it's a perfectly fine if Bosnia and Herzegovina were to break up. I mean, I got to put that on out there. I think it's perfectly fine. If you can break up Yugoslavia, you can absolutely break up Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I don't have any problem with that. I think Bosnia and Herzegovina was an artificial state. It had never been a proper state. It was a piece of territory, had been passed around from one empire to another empire and another empire, and then it was under the control of Croatia, Ustasha Croatia in World War II. So it was an artificial creation. So it had never been as an independent state. So once you destroy a really existing state such as Yugoslavia, then you can't really then insist on the fiction of a fake state such as Bosnia and Herzegovina. The issue of the Serb secession from the Republika Srpska, the secession of the Republika Srpska from Bosnia and Herzegovina, this has been going on for decades. We've been hearing about this for decades. Milorad Dodik, who's also been around for decades, he has been threatening, warning that I'm ready to secede. They have not done so. They haven't done it. And the reason they haven't done it is that they don't want to provoke a possible NATO intervention. So it could well happen. I mean, if NATO decides to launch bombs again at the Serbs, they can do so. There's no one's going to come in and help the Serbs. So that's why there's this brinkmanship that Dodik has engaged in, but Dodik has always backed down because hasn't been willing to take the risk. I have no problem at all in principle with the breakup of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I just don't think it's likely to happen. So therefore, why this is an easy one for NATO. They've already done it. They did it before. In the 1990s. They know that the Serbs are kind of isolated. They don't really have anyone to support them except Russia. Russia's got its hands full right now. There's not a great deal Russia could do. There wasn't much Russia could do for them in the 1990s. There's even less that they'd be able to do. So I don't think I see no evidence at all that the Serbs are moving towards secession from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Robert says, ciao from 100 degree Fahrenheit, good Fahrenheit, Garden State. Okay, so it's pretty warm. Garden State, where at MetLife Stadium on July the 5th, Norway plays Brazil. Well, that will be interesting. Well, that's interesting. I mean, who do I think will win? Let me think how would go for it. In these early rounds of the World Cup, it's always very hard to see how good teams are, whether they're holding something back. I mean, Brazil certainly hasn't been terribly impressive up until now, but they've done enough to get through. Norway strikes me as being a one-man band. I don't think they've got that many players. So if I'm put on the spot, who do I think will win? I will go for Brazil. I think Brazil will defeat Norway, but I'm not putting any money on it. So but I think Brazil will have enough to take on Norway. As I say, I get the feeling Norway is just basically a one-man team. Anyway, then Cynthia goes on. In 1999, Russia's prime minister, that was Primakov, Yevgeny Primakov, turned his plane around midair to protest NATO's bombing Yugoslavia. Waged without UN rules, the attack scared Russia and China, and 80% of Ukrainians saw NATO as a threat. Declassified UK files show the West lied, promising this won't set a precedent for future wars. Yet the West broke its word, using the Kosovo precedent to crush Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. This destroyed the trust, forcing big powers to fight back. Kit argues this pushed Iran to study and break the U.S. grip. Well, it's very interesting. I mean, Iran was on the wrong side in the wars in Yugoslavia. Remember, Iran was supporting the Muslims in Bosnia, providing arms and all kinds of Mujahideen fighters, helping to transfer Mujahideen fighters to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Richard Holbrooke wrote about this very vividly in his book, To End the War, about the active cooperation that the United States and Iran engaged in order to support the Muslims of Bosnia against the Serbs. So a lot of these countries, whether it's in particularly the Muslim world, saw what was going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina as a kind of a holy war. They regard this as a holy war against the Christian infidels. And, Iran wasn't the only one. Of course, Saudi Arabia and other states did so and were working hand in glove with the Americans against the Serbs. And the Americans quite skillfully, quite dishonestly, but quite skillfully played on Muslim fears about being subjected to Christian barbarians and Christian crusaders, and that somehow that they were threatened, that Muslims were under threat from massacre by Christians. The Americans did something similar in the case of Chechnya. They did very much as, hey, these are poor Muslims, just like Muslims in Kosovo, like the Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Muslims in Chechnya and Dagestan. They are being victimized by Christians. And this is what the Americans played with that, and Iran very much went along with that, and we're more than happy to see to see the Serbs defeated in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they offered very little support to the Serbs, who were indeed, as you said, attacked without any kind of a UN Security Council resolution. Now, what the Americans and the West did was to say, well, this is sui generis. They never really expressed why this was sui generis, what was so special in this case. Well, the only thing that was special was that they would never be able to get any kind of a UN Security Council authorization, because there was no way that Russia or China would accept the use of force in Yugoslavia, NATO use of force. So essentially they went around the United Nations and just simply authorized the attacks on the Serbs. Now, Primakov, it was, of course, an absolute dunderhead. He got on a plane to go to the United States. And as you say, he then turned around when then Clinton announced the start of the attack. Now, when I say he's a dunderhead, everybody knew, everybody and his uncle. There's nobody could have not known the Americans are going to do this. Clinton had already announced after after the Rambouillet meetings, and basically the key, the absolute essential thing that the Americans needed was for the KLA to say, "Oh, we accept the American proposal," and for the Serbs to say, "We don't accept it." That's all they needed, because up until then, the KLA had not accepted this. Because what the KLA wanted was a promise of a referendum. Now, a referendum was in fact secretly promised to them, which is why the KLA accepted it. But the crucial thing was that once they got a situation where the KLA had accepted the American proposal and the Serbs who were being obdurate and rejected it, then this was the dream that they had wanted, which is now we can bomb the Serbs. We can bomb and coerce the Serbs into accepting this agreement. Now, once he had that, of course, Clinton was going to go ahead with it. The crucial event there was, remember, there were these the Kosovo verification mission, which was in Kosovo by that creep William Walker. So William Walker led his verification mission out of Kosovo because he knew the bombing was coming. The bombing was coming, and so he led them from Kosovo into Macedonia. So everybody knew this was coming. What the hell did Primakov think he was doing in getting on a plane to go and talk to Clinton? Clinton had already told him, "We're going to bomb." He knew this was coming. So this grand theatrical gesture of he turned this plane back. I mean, you think, what kind of an idiot gets on a plane to fly to the United States when they've already made clear that they're going to do it, that they're going to bomb the Serbs? So, I'm very unimpressed by Primakov and his book, a stupid, very bad book that he wrote. You can read it. He shows that he despised the Serbs. He despised Milosevic. I have no time for him. I know Lavrov seems to always talk, Primakov. He's nothing. He's intellectually a zero. Just read his book and you can see what a complete dunderhead, fool, idiot he really was. So the hell with him. All right, now when you get to the Kosovo precedent, well, yeah, I mean, the part that was when he said, well, the two aspects of the Kosovo precedent, which was obviously you launch an attack without UN Security Council authorization. Well, the United States had always done that. I mean, there was no authorization by the UN to the war in Vietnam. There was no UN authorization for that. And now you could say that the Iraq, there was no UN authorization for that. When I should say, though, that George W. Bush, though he's been much attacked and reasonably so, he did actually make an effort to get UN Security Council authorization for the invasion of Iraq. He didn't get it because the Russians, the Chinese, and then the French also were opposed to it. But he did make the effort. He did go before the UN and try to get authorization. Clinton didn't even do that. Clinton made no effort because Clinton knew that he was never going to get it. So he made no effort whatsoever to get the authorization. Now, the other aspect that you said with the precedent was the recognition of unilateral secession by Kosovo. That was an awkward one because you're not really supposed to recognize unilateral secession, but the Americans and the Europeans had already done that in the case of the breakup of Yugoslavia. So it wasn't really that much of a stretch for them to turn around and say, well, we now recognize it in the case of Kosovo. The part that was a little difficult in the recognition of Kosovo on the part of the United States and, of course, its NATO partners was that the UN Security Council resolution 1244 kind of listed Kosovo as a part of Serbia. So you kind of you have this resolution, then you kind of ignore it by going ahead with recognizing independence of Kosovo. That was as I say, Iraq. Yeah, that was they at least tried to do it. Libya. I mean, all these, no question, these were all acts of aggression, and often as a result of profound dishonesty. So, in the case of Libya, there was a UN Security Council resolution, but the UN Security Council resolution consisted of an arms embargo plus a no-fly zone. But since there was no one was flying anything in Libya, there was really no need for NATO to enforce any kind of a no-fly zone because nothing was going up in the air. So in fact, what NATO did with that UN Security Council resolution was to use it in order to wage a war against Gaddafi, to overthrow Gaddafi. This was the this regime change operation. So they of course invoked the UN Security Council resolution, but the UN Security Council resolution had been very limited: arms embargo and a no-fly zone. Nothing about regime change, and particularly when Obama, who was the clown who was the president of France at the time? Was it Sarkozy or Hollande? I think it was still Sarkozy. Sarkozy, and who was the UK? Oh, that was that creature, David Cameron. You remember they wrote an op-ed, so, oh, we're not doing regime change. No regime, we're not doing regime change. And of course, that was exactly what they were doing. They were doing regime change. Now, in terms of your broader point about the how Russia and China felt about that, yeah, I think that was it shook up Russia. It shouldn't have done. Russia should have known exactly what the United States was doing, but nonetheless, it was a jolt to Russia. That Primakov. Every time I bring this, what the hell did Primakov think he was doing? You can go fly in your plane to Washington, talk to Clinton. Talk about what? What was he planning to talk about with Clinton? But nonetheless, there was these illusions, these horrible people who were in power in Russia at the time. They were shown to have been complete dolts, morons in believing American promises, Western promises, all this. So even as late as 1999, they still believed these American promises. But it was a jolt, and it obviously led to the ouster of Yeltsin. and his replacement by Putin. But I can't say that the policy changed that much because um, the, Russia just continued cooperating and working with the West. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia went on all the way up until 2023. And the ICTY, which was obviously there to provide a post facto rationalization of what NATO did, we've seen Milosevic said that. Milosevic openly said that's what the ICTY is about. It was obvious that that's what it was about. Yet the Russia continued to support the ICTY. Year in, year out, they continued to support it. So, yes, it was a jolt to the system, but it wasn't enough of a jolt. It should have been a wake up call. It really wasn't. And if Russia had actually reacted with a little more energy in '99, then maybe Ukraine could have been avoided. Anyway, thank you. Very 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 interesting comment, Cynthia. And here is this is Marty. Always good to see you. Really happy to see you again here, Marty. And Marty has this picture, the state portrait of Angela Merkel. This is the unveiling of her state portrait. Quite why she gets a state portrait, and I'm not quite sure. But it looks very very she very much like her frumpy and wearing that, I guess, like a house coat. I mean, I can't say it's exactly a suit or anything like that. It's just she's just look like wearing a house coat. But yeah, there is Angela Merkel, and there's a painting of her behind her. There's a touch of Magritte about that picture that provided by Marty, like Magritte, where you have the mirror image and the actual person. You see the back of the person, or the front, and so on. It has the surreal quality, the painting, and and Merkel. You don't really know which is the painting and which is the real Merkel. So when I look at that, I say I'm not sure which is Merkel and which is the painting. So that's what I mean. What Marty has done is kind of bring up Magritte. So thank you so much, Marty. Always appreciate your generosity and your humor. And Aubergine, thank you so much for your generosity. So it says, Dear George, warm greetings from Novi Sad, Újvidék. That's in Hungarian. So warm greetings to you, Aubergine. I listened with great interest to your interview with Vladimir Krashelyanin. In your view, what is the most important question observers should be asking about Serbia's upcoming election as it navigates between the EU and Russia? Well, that's a really good question. I think what they should be asking is whether this path that Vucic has chosen is a sustainable one. Is it possible for Serbia to continue to play this game of one minute they're supporting Russia, next minute they're providing arms to Ukraine, next minute they're making nice with Brussels, next minute they're back, being friendly with Moscow. Vucic has been doing this for years and years and years. Is this sustainable? And can Serbia continue like this? And so I think that would be one question really. Can you do this, and does it really achieve anything for Serbia in the long run? And I guess the other aspect of it is what I would have wanted to know. After Vucic, what? I mean, is there an alternative to Vucic? And if there is an alternative to Vucic, which way would that go? Would it go towards the west, or would it go towards the east? I mean, Vucic says, okay, well, he doesn't really want to make any kind of a choice. But I certainly want to know, particularly when there was this opposition, the students and so on. Well, what is it? What do they want? Yes, they complain about corruption, but this is now becoming this ubiquitous movement in Europe, this opposition to corruption. What are they about? And which way do they want to go? So we have an idea of what Vucicism is about, which is basically to choose not to choose. All right, is that sustainable? Is there then an alternative? Is there somebody else in Serbia who would make a more decisive move? Because at one point, Kršuljanin said, well, Vucic really lacked the courage of Milosevic. Okay, well, that would have been interesting. What would Milosevic do in these circumstances? And is there anybody like that in Serbia who today could play the role of Milosevic? I mean, I think I would have wanted some answers to these questions. Maybe there are no answers to these questions. So anyway, thank you so much, Augustin. Really appreciate your generosity, and there's Anne Marie. Always very good to see you, Anne Marie. Really appreciate your being here. Anne Marie is an outstanding musician, a musician of international renown, who has played in some of the most famous orchestras in the world, played with the most distinguished composers and conductors of the 20th and 21st centuries. And she's here to lend us, the benefit of her extraordinary knowledge and wisdom about music and the practice of music. And we really appreciate you here. As I say, it's another benefit of joining our locals community. You get to enjoy the very learned and fascinating musical commentary by Anne Marie, who brings years of experience to her observations. So thank you so much, Anne Marie. And I see here that you asked me, how was the ring? It was very good. I have to say, I think you mentioned in one of your comments about what it's like to play music in conditions which are rather hot and uncomfortable. The conditions at MUPA here in Budapest were indeed hot and uncomfortable for the ring. Yes, there is air conditioning, but only when the music is not being played. While the music is being played and the singers are singing, then there's no air conditioning. And after about an hour or an hour and a half, it does become quite taxing. So that's just for the audience. I have to think that it must be quite taxing for members of the orchestra. So that's why. And I was thinking about you while I was, listening to the Wagners. Wow, I can now see what Anne Marie meant by playing in really trying circumstances. But as always, Wagner's music is great, and the staging is obviously a little unusual. MUPA isn't, strictly speaking, an opera house, but nonetheless, there was a lot of interest, a lot of dramas. So I saw the three out of the four. So I saw Götterdämmerung, Siegfried, and Die Walküre, and well, it was pretty much as you would expect. In my view, go to Demmering is, I think, the most exciting. Siegfried also very, very interesting. A lot of interesting drama. Die Walküre has always been the one that of the four um, music dramas of the cycle. I think it's always been my least favorite. It has really long passages that are really quite boring. And I think here again, it was some of it was a little boring. But I think Götterdämmerung and Siegfried made up for it. I missed Das Rheingold. That's always a lot of fun. It's actually very short by Wagnerian standards, about 3 hours, but it does pack a wallop. There's an awful lot that happens in Das Rheingold. So, but I missed it this time. So, but anyway, thank you, Anne-Marie, for asking. And I will be posting another contribution to the music club very shortly. I'm not going to give away what I'll be posting, but I hope that Anne-Marie, you'll find the time to listen and maybe offer some comments and thoughts about it. So anyway, thank you so much as always for your generosity. And then Robert says an RT article has claimed that while appearing in an RT video, apparently not yet grounds for being whisked off to the Who's Go, sharing an RT video increasingly is. The workaround should be to say, hey, George, was magnificent on episode X of Crosstalk. Sorry, I can't give you the link. It's claimed that while appearing in an RT video is apparently not yet grounds for being whisked off to the Who's Go, sharing an RT video increasingly is. I am, that's interesting. I'm going to see if I can find this. What to say was an episode X. Yeah, it's one of these things that is indeed it's a very murky area, and of course, as you know, the whole area of sanctions. There's never any law behind it. There's never any legislation behind it. There's no democratic accountability. There's no judicial process behind it. These are just decrees issued by Kaja Kallas, and if you fall afoul of them, they're going to get very, very nasty. The consequences could be very dire. We've seen it with others, and it's not like a process whereby you have a right to appeal. You go to a court. You go to your lawyers. You file motions. Then you have ask also a temporary injunction or whatever, and to enjoin the EU not to enforce the imposition of the sanctions. You don't have any of that. Just from one day to the next, from Kaja Kallas's histrionic decision to your bank account being closed, boom, there's about 5 seconds in it. So it's quite horrific. So yeah. Again, anyway, thank you, Robert, for that. I'll look that up. So, and then Cynthia says Brazil also has the advantage over Norway when playing in high temperatures. No, I think that's right. And they obviously they have the experience. I mean, they've won the World Cup more times than anyone. They've won it 5 times, though they haven't won it in a number of years. But they've now become known as the slow starters. So far they haven't looked particularly impressive, but I think it's right to pace yourself. It's a long tournament. You don't want to show everything you've got in the early matches. So I still think that they're holding something back, and that they've got more in the tank than Norway does. But anyway, that's what I think. But yeah, the high temperatures, I think, yeah, it will should work to their advantage. And then anyway, Anne Marie then says, I read Seymour Hersh's recent article, and I wonder why he's saying, like the Western mainstream media, that the battlefield is now turning against Russia, against what many in the alternative media are saying. What is actually the truth? And if this is not true, why would he say such a thing? He's, I mean, Seymour Hersh often has, a quite conventional view on things. Now, my feeling is that the battlefield is not turned against Russia. I think that what what has caused problems for Russia are obviously the attacks, the drone attacks behind the lines. Obviously, the attacks on the refineries, attacks on oil depots. They have been setbacks for Russia, but I don't see any evidence, and no one has presented any evidence that the battlefield itself has turned against Russia. Russia's still making steady progress in the Donbass. Now we can argue, move on to the next stage, and we've talked about this many times before, that even if Russia takes the Donbass, even if it takes Kherson and Zaporozhye, what happens then? Because Ukraine will continue with this regime in Ukraine, will continue to work with NATO, and will continue to be NATO's battering ram against Russia. That's even after Russia takes the Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. But I haven't seen any evidence that Ukraine is making any kind of headway, military headway. And to the contrary, Russia is making slow and steady progress. I mean, it's taking a while, but it's making slow progress in Konstantinovka. And then it's going to move on to Slavyansk. I mean, they're already talking about moving next to Slavyansk. So they're doing what I think we've always expected them to do. They're going to attack the heavily fortified defense line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. So and then they're going to take Lyman, and they're going to take additional territories in Ukraine. I think it's going to take time, but the claim that somehow Ukraine is winning on the battlefield, that doesn't arise with any kind of evidence. Just like the claims that that Russia is suffering casualties 8-1, eight times greater than the casualties Ukraine is suffering. And then you ask, well, where's that evidence? Where'd you get this evidence from? And it turns out, well, these are the estimates of the UK and the American government. Well, why should I believe that? I mean, of course, they're going to say that. That's they, they're partisans on Ukraine's side. So obviously they're going to say, yeah, Russia's suffering these enormous casualties, but it doesn't come with any evidence. And one obvious source of evidence is when they have these body exchanges. Why is it that Russia hands over 8 times the number of Ukrainian bodies than Ukraine hands over Russian bodies? I mean, that makes no sense. But nonetheless, the media just continue to regurgitate this. But the point is that to argue that the battlefield has turned against Russia is just simply wrong. I mean, yeah, it's a grind. It's very slow, but I haven't seen any evidence that Ukraine has made any. What has Ukraine gained? What piece of strategic real estate has Ukraine won? When you could say, well, yeah, look, the battlefield is turning into Ukraine's favor. I mean, that's the minimum you have to show. Oh, Ukraine has recaptured something, and so therefore the battlefield is turning against Russia. There's no evidence of that. what people are doing is to confound two different things, which is the attacks by the drones, which are obviously an embarrassment and are causing some hardships in Russia, with progress on the battlefield. And I haven't seen any evidence that Ukraine is making any particular gains on the battlefield. It's a grind, but I don't see that Ukraine's doing anything much. Anyway, thank you so much, Anne Marie, for that question. Now, I said, why Seymour Hersh is saying it? Well, as I said, he often has surprisingly conventional views. He's done a lot of good work, but he's also, I think, subscribed to very, I don't know, things which to me seem trite and unlikely, but is conventional. But anyway, and then Anne Marie says, "I agree with Valkyrie." Thank you for that. But anyway, I said I'll be posting a new piece of music very shortly. So I'm looking forward to the Gagglers and of course Anne Marie's response to that. Anyway, my time is up. Should be up. It's been it should have been up some time ago. So thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Thank you very much for all your really interesting questions and comments and thoughts. And again, as I say, if you want me to answer your questions, please join our community, the gaggle.locals.com. It's well worth it. As you can see, the members of the community are really, really interesting and really talented, and always have very stimulating comments and observation to follow. So anyway, we're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then we'll be back for a joint live stream with Peter on Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and then on Tuesday, I'll be back with my solo live stream. I hope to see you all then. Until then, all the best. Good night.